The sky was painted with soft shades of orange and pink as the sun began to dip behind the row of tall buildings. The small park at the edge of the city buzzed with the laughter of children. Their voices carried through the cool air, mixed with the chirping of birds returning to their nests. Parents sat on benches, chatting quietly or scrolling through their phones while keeping an eye on their little ones. Among them was a small family, a young couple and their bright-eyed daughter, no more than 6 years old. The girl had her hair tied in 2 messy ponytails and wore a yellow dress that fluttered as she ran from one swing to another. Her mother sat on a bench nearby, smiling as she watched her daughter try to climb the slide for the 5th time in a row. Her father stood a few steps away, arms crossed, pretending to look serious, though his eyes followed the little girl with pure affection. He worked long hours during the week, but Sundays were sacred. They were family days. Nothing was allowed to come between them on Sundays. The man wasn't rich. He worked as a mechanic in a local garage, and his wife taught at a preschool. Life wasn't easy, but their home was full of laughter, warmth, and love. They had been trying for another baby for a few years, but had recently started the process of adopting a child. The little girl had been thrilled at the idea of having a younger brother. She talked about him constantly, drawing pictures of herself holding his hand, or pretending to talk to him before bed. It was one of those peaceful afternoons when life feels simple and complete, at least until something unexpected happens. Not far from them, on the opposite side of the park, an older man walked slowly along the path. He looked like someone important, dressed neatly in a gray suit even though it was a Sunday. His shoes shone, his silver hair was perfectly combed, and he carried a small cup of coffee in one hand. People often recognized him, though few approached. He was one of those faces often seen on magazine covers or TV interviews, a man who had everything. His name was Richard Hamilton. He owned a well-known real estate company and had made millions building apartment complexes and business centers across the city. Some admired him, others envied him, but if anyone had looked closely that afternoon, they would have noticed the loneliness behind his eyes. Richard came to this park often, not because he enjoyed watching children play, but because it reminded him of something he couldn't explain, a part of his past that still haunted him. There was a quiet corner of the park where he liked to sit, near the tall oak tree beside the swings. It was peaceful there, a small escape from meetings, phone calls, and the empty silence of his large house. That day, he had just finished a business lunch nearby and decided to take a short walk. He had been feeling tired lately, not the kind of tired that sleep can fix, but the kind that comes from carrying too many regrets. As he walked, he noticed the little girl in the yellow dress laughing as she ran in circles. Her laughter was infectious. For a moment, he smiled without realizing it. It reminded him of the sound of another child's laughter, a memory buried deep in the corners of his mind, one that he thought he had long forgotten. He slowed his pace, eyes following the girl as she ran to the bench where her mother sat. Just then he noticed a small boy sitting a few feet away on another bench. The boy looked quiet, holding a small toy car in his hand. His clothes were clean but simple, and his expression was calm, almost thoughtful. The girl noticed him too. She stopped mid-run and stared at the boy. Something about him caught her attention. Maybe it was his eyes or the way he sat quietly while other kids ran around. Her mother called her name, but the girl didn't respond. Instead, she pointed at the boy and said loudly, "Daddy, that's my brother." Her father, who had been talking to someone nearby, turned around in surprise. "What?" he asked, walking closer. The little girl looked at him, eyes wide with certainty. "That's him, Daddy, that's my brother." Everyone nearby turned to look. The park grew oddly quiet for a second, as if the wind had stopped moving. The boy on the bench looked confused. He held his toy car a little tighter and glanced around nervously. The girl's mother hurried over, trying to hush her daughter. "Sweetheart, don't say things like that," she said softly, embarrassed. "You don't even know him." But the little girl shook her head. "No, Mommy, it's him. Remember the picture I drew? That's him. That's my brother." Her parents exchanged puzzled looks. They had only just started the adoption process. They hadn't even met any children yet. How could she be so sure? Meanwhile, Richard Hamilton, standing a few feet away, froze in place. His hand tightened around the cup of coffee until it trembled. His eyes went from the little girl to the boy on the bench, and suddenly his heart skipped a beat. The boy had the same eyes. The same deep brown eyes that used to look back at him from the mirror when he was young. There was even a small scar on the boy's chin, a faint mark that mirrored the one Richard had gotten as a child after falling from a bike. His pulse began to race. For a moment he forgot to breathe. His vision blurred slightly as memories he had locked away for decades began to stir. He took a hesitant step forward, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pain. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice almost trembling, directed at the couple. Did she say that's her brother?" The father looked at him, a bit startled. "Oh, sorry, sir," he said politely. "Kids say the funniest things, don't they? She's been talking about her future brother for weeks now." Richard's throat tightened. "Future brother?" he repeated quietly. "Yes." The man continued, smiling awkwardly. "We're in the middle of adopting. We haven't been matched yet, but she already feels like he's real." Richard looked again at the boy, who was now staring back at him with curious eyes. Something inside him broke. It was as if time folded in on itself, pulling him back to a different life. A smaller apartment, a young woman with soft eyes, laughter, dreams, and the sound of rain on a tin roof. He remembered her, the only person who had ever truly seen him before he became who he was now. Her name echoed faintly in his mind, followed by a deep ache in his chest. The boy looked so much like her. For a moment, Richard couldn't move. The father thanked him politely and began guiding his daughter away, gently telling her not to disturb strangers. The mother nodded apologetically and smiled before following. The boy, still sitting alone, watched them go. Richard stood frozen, watching every step they took. When the little girl turned around one last time to wave, he felt tears sting the back of his eyes. He didn't even understand why. He turned and sat on the nearby bench, setting his coffee down with a trembling hand. His chest felt heavy. He tried to take deep breaths, but his heart kept pounding faster and faster. What were the odds, he thought. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. But something deep inside told him it was more than coincidence. That look, those eyes. It was like staring into a reflection of the past. The next few minutes passed in a haze. The sound of laughter around him grew faint. He could only hear the echo of the little girl's voice in his head. "Daddy, that's my brother." He didn't know what to make of it, but something inside him whispered that this moment wasn't random. After some time, he stood up and started walking toward the exit of the park. But halfway there he stopped again. The little boy was still sitting alone, playing quietly with his toy car. His head was tilted slightly downward, but every now and then, he glanced at the people passing by, almost as if waiting for someone who never came. Richard felt an overwhelming pull toward him. He hesitated for a long time, then slowly approached. "Hey there," he said gently, crouching down to the boy's level. "That's a nice car you've got." The boy looked up surprised but didn't say anything. He just nodded shyly. Richard smiled faintly. "I had one just like that when I was your age," he said. "Only mine was red. This one's blue," the boy whispered. "Blue's my favorite color." "Good choice," Richard said softly. "It's a strong color." The boy smiled a little, still holding the car tightly. Richard studied him closely, trying to stay calm even as emotions swirled inside him. "Are your parents here?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "No, my foster dad's coming soon," he said. "He's talking to someone." Foster dad. The words hit Richard like a wave. He nodded slowly, trying to mask the tremor in his hands. "You're a brave kid," he said quietly. "How old are you?" 7, the boy answered proudly. "Almost 8. Richard smiled again, but his throat ached too much to speak. He wanted to ask 100 questions, about his name, where he lived, who his foster parents were, but something held him back. It wasn't his place, not yet. Just then a man in his 30s approached, tall, kind-looking, wearing casual clothes. "Hey, buddy," he called warmly. "Ready to go?" The boy jumped up. "Yes!" he said, running to him. The man smiled at Richard politely. "Thanks for keeping him company, sir," he said. Richard nodded. "He's a good kid," the man chuckled. "Yeah, he's one of a kind," he said proudly, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're hoping to finalize his adoption soon. He deserves a good home." Richard's heart stopped. Adoption, the same word the little girl's father had used earlier. His mind began to spin. He wanted to say something, but no words came out. He could only stand there frozen, as the man thanked him again and walked away with the boy. The sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the park. Richard stood there for a long time, staring at the empty bench. His breathing was uneven, his hands trembling slightly. He had everything money could buy: houses, his business partner's fame. Yet at that moment, he felt more hollow than ever. He walked out of the park slowly, his thoughts tangled, heart pounding. Was it just a strange coincidence, or was life trying to tell him something he wasn't ready to face? That night, Richard lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The image of the boy's face kept flashing before his eyes, those familiar eyes the same as hers, and the little girl's voice echoed again in his head like a whisper from fate. "Daddy, that's my brother." He turned onto his side, buried his face in his hands, and for the first time in years, tears quietly rolled down his cheeks. That night he couldn't sleep. The quiet of the house felt heavier than usual. Every sound, the ticking clock on the wall, the soft hum of the air conditioner, seemed louder, sharper. He turned over on the bed again and again, staring at the ceiling, then at the dark window. His mind wouldn't stop replaying that afternoon in the park. The little girl's voice still echoed in his ears. "Daddy, that's my brother." It had sounded so innocent, yet so certain. And then there was the boy, the quiet one with the brown eyes and the tiny scar on his chin. That face wouldn't leave his mind. It wasn't just about resemblance. There was something else, something deeper, a strange feeling that he couldn't put into words, a connection that made no sense but also felt too strong to ignore. He got out of bed and walked to the living room. The floor felt cold under his feet. He poured himself a glass of water, but his hands trembled so much that he spilled a little on the counter. He took a deep breath and sat down on the couch. On the coffee table lay a photo frame. It showed him standing in front of one of his buildings, smiling proudly, shaking hands with a mayor. The picture had been taken years ago, when he had been awarded for his contributions to urban development. He looked at that smiling version of himself and felt nothing. The man in the photo looked happy, confident, complete, but that version of him no longer existed. Somewhere along the line, he had traded all that he loved for success. He leaned back and closed his eyes. His thoughts drifted back to a time long ago, a time when he didn't own fancy suits or live in a mansion. He had been just another young man trying to make ends meet, living in a small apartment above a grocery store. Back then, he had someone by his side. Her name was Clara. She wasn't rich or glamorous, but she had a heart that made everything around her feel warmer. She worked at a local bakery and used to bring him bread that had just come out of the oven. He remembered her laughter, soft and real, the kind of sound that made ordinary days feel like something special. They had dreams. They talked about building a life together, maybe moving to a bigger city, opening their own cafe someday. They didn't have much, but they had hope. But life has a strange way of testing people. An opportunity had come his way, one that promised a better future. A big company had offered him a chance to move across the country for a real estate project. It meant money, growth, and status, but it also meant leaving everything behind. Clara had begged him to stay. "We can make our life here," she had said, tears in her eyes. "We don't need millions. We just need each other." He remembered how she had held his hand that night, her voice trembling. But ambition has a way of silencing love. He had told her that he'd come back once he was stable, once he'd made something of himself. He never came back. Months turned into years, and the more successful he became, the harder it became to look back. The last time he had thought of her was when he saw her name in a letter she had sent him. He had never opened it. He had told himself it was better that way, that the past should stay buried. Now, decades later, he couldn't stop wondering what had happened to her, and why, after all these years, that boy in the park had made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt since she left his life. He stood up, walked to his study, and opened a drawer filled with old papers and photos. Buried under documents and awards, he found it, a yellowed envelope with faded handwriting. Her name was written neatly on the front. He had kept it all this time, though he had never read it. His hands trembled as he opened it. The paper was fragile, the ink slightly smudged. Her words were simple but heavy. "I wish I could hate you, but I can't. I just wish you had known before you left that you were going to be a father. I don't expect anything from you. I just hope you never forget that once we had something real." The letter slipped from his hands. He sank into the chair, staring at nothing. A father. He had a son out there. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He had spent his whole life chasing numbers, projects and deals, and all along there had been someone, his own blood, living without him. He sat there for hours, unable to move. When the morning light finally crept through the curtains, he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore this anymore. Over the next few days, he couldn't focus on work. His assistant noticed the change but didn't say anything. He sat in meetings, nodded at proposals, signed documents, but his mind was elsewhere. Every moment he thought of that boy in the park. He needed to find out more. On the third day, he returned to the park. He sat on the same bench near the oak tree and waited. The same families came and went. Children ran around, but the boy wasn't there. He waited for hours, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Finally, on the fourth afternoon, he saw him again. The same quiet boy holding his blue toy car, walking beside a man he recognized as the foster father. Richard's heart started to race. He wanted to walk up and talk, but he didn't know what to say. He didn't even know if he had the right. He decided to wait until the man sat down. When the boy went to play, Richard approached carefully. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I think we've met before. You're fostering that boy, right?" The man smiled. "Yes, that's right," he said warmly. "He's a great kid. Why do you ask?" Richard hesitated. I was just curious," he said softly. "He reminds me of someone I once knew." The man nodded. "He does that to people," he said with a chuckle. "He has that face everyone feels connected to. Poor kid's been through a lot. But he's strong." Richard frowned slightly. "Through a lot?" The man's smile faded. "Yeah, he lost his mother a few years ago. She got sick, and since then he's been in and out of foster care. We're hoping to adopt him soon, but there's still some paperwork." Richard's chest tightened. "Did you say his mother passed away?" "Yes," the man said softly. "She was a kind woman from what I've heard. Never had much, but she loved that boy more than anything." Richard felt the ground tilt beneath him. He wanted to ask her name, but his voice caught in his throat. "Do you know her name?" he finally managed to whisper. The man thought for a second. "Clara, I believe," he said. The world stopped. He felt the air leave his lungs. His knees went weak and he had to grip the side of the bench to steady himself. He stared at the man, unable to speak. "Clara." It couldn't be coincidence anymore. He took a deep breath, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Do you mind if I ask the boy's name?" "Lucas," the man said with a smile. "Lucas Carter, why?" Richard couldn't answer. He nodded politely and stepped back. His hands trembled so hard that he had to shove them in his pockets. Lucas. The name she had once said she loved. She had told him years ago that if she ever had a son, she would name him Lucas. He had laughed then, promising that he'd help raise him someday. Now here he was, a stranger to his own child. He walked away from the park that day without looking back. When he got home, he closed the door, sat down on the couch and buried his face in his hands. For the rest of the week, he couldn't think straight. Every time he tried to work, his mind drifted back to that moment. He thought of the letter again, of Clara's words, of the boy's face. He had always believed that his wealth could fix anything, that money could fill any gap. But this was something no amount of money could repair. He began digging through old contacts, trying to find any information about Clara, where she had lived, what had happened to her. He contacted a friend who worked in local records. Days later, he got a message confirming what he already feared. Clara had passed away 5 years ago, but one line stood out. Survived by one child, Lucas Carter. That night, Richard couldn't hold it in anymore. He cried, really cried for the first time in decades. He cried for the woman he left behind, for the son he never knew, for the years that were gone forever. When the tears stopped, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something now. The next day, he went back to the park again. He saw the foster father sitting on the bench while Lucas played nearby. He gathered his courage and walked up to him. "Sir," he began, his voice low but steady, "I need to tell you something important." The man looked at him, surprised. "I think—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I think that boy might be my son." The man blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Your son?" Yes, Richard said softly. I knew his mother a long time ago, before I became who I am now. There was a long silence. The man looked at him carefully, searching his face for any hint of dishonesty. He saw none. After a moment, he nodded slowly. That's a lot to take in, he said quietly. But if what you're saying is true, maybe there's a way to confirm it. Richard nodded. A DNA test, he said firmly. I can arrange everything. I don't want to cause trouble. I just need to know. The man studied him for a while longer, then finally said, All right, let's see what the truth really is. As Richard walked away, he felt both terrified and hopeful. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about money, deals, or reputation. He was thinking about family, about the one he had lost and the chance, however small, to make it right. That night, as he looked out at the city lights from his window, he whispered softly to himself, If you're really mine, I'll never let you go again. Outside, the world went on as usual, unaware that in one quiet corner of the city, a man who had everything was finally realizing what truly mattered. The next few days passed in a blur. Richard could hardly eat or sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was the boy's face. The same eyes, the same quiet nature, the same scar on the chin. He could almost hear Clara's voice whispering through the years. He had spent decades thinking success meant having everything. But now he understood that the most valuable thing he had ever lost wasn't money, it was time. Time with the people who had truly mattered. The man from the park had agreed to meet him again. They arranged to meet privately to discuss the DNA test. When the day finally came, Richard felt like his heart might break out of his chest. He had faced board meetings, investors, and journalists, but nothing had ever made him this nervous. He arrived early at a small cafe near the park. He sat at a corner table, checking his watch every few minutes. The place smelled of roasted coffee and fresh pastries. He barely noticed. Then he saw them. The foster father walking in with the boy beside him. The boy looked around curiously, his small hand holding the man's. When he saw Richard, he gave a shy little nod. Hello again, the man said, offering a polite smile. I told him we were meeting a friend. Richard smiled weakly. Thank you for coming. They sat down. For a while, no one spoke. The boy played quietly with his blue toy car on the table. Richard watched him, trying to stay composed. Every little movement reminded him of himself at that age. Finally, the foster father spoke. So how do we do this? I've already spoken to a private clinic, Richard said softly. It's a simple processing, just a cheek swab. I'll take care of everything. You won't have to pay a thing. The man nodded. All right, he said slowly. If it gives you peace of mind. Richard looked at the boy. It's not just about peace of mind, he said quietly. It's about truth. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. I just want to know if I still have a chance to make one thing right. The boy looked up at him curiously. Are you sad? He asked innocently. The question caught him off guard. He forced a small smile. Maybe a little, he said. But seeing you makes it a bit better. The boy smiled back shyly, then went back to rolling his toy car. The three of them finished their drinks and left for the clinic. The process was quick. In a few minutes, a simple swab, and then the wait began. The results would take a few days. When they parted ways outside, Richard knelt slightly to meet the boy's eyes. It was nice seeing you again, he said softly. You're a very special boy, the boy grinned. Everyone says that, he replied proudly. I believe them, Richard said with a small laugh. As they walked away, he stood there for a long time, watching until they disappeared down the street. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that comes when something long hidden is finally being brought to light. That night, the house felt even quieter than before. He tried to distract himself with work, but the spreadsheets and reports looked meaningless. He wandered through the big rooms, staring at photos on the walls, all images of him at ceremonies, business events, award nights. In every picture, he was surrounded by people but still looked alone. He went into his study, opened a drawer, and took out a small old photo, the only one he still had of Clara. She was standing by a window, sunlight spilling over her face. Her eyes looked so alive, so full of warmth. He touched the corner of the photo with his thumb. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have come back. I should have been there. The days that followed felt endless. Each morning he woke up hoping for a call from the clinic. Each night he went to bed with that same ache in his chest. He avoided meetings, canceled trips, and barely left the house. Finally, one afternoon, his phone rang. The number belonged to the clinic. His hand shook as he answered. "Mr. Hamilton," the voice on the other end said. "The DNA test results are ready." His throat felt dry. "And?" he asked, barely able to speak. There was a short pause. "It's a 99.9% match," the voice said gently. "The boy is your biological son," he froze. For a moment, the room seemed to spin. He had imagined this moment 100 times, but hearing it confirmed felt unreal. He sat down slowly, covering his face with his hands. A lifetime of regret came crashing down at once. He didn't know how long he sat there, but when he finally looked up, his cheeks were wet with tears. He had spent years building towers that touched the sky, but he had failed to build the one thing that mattered most: a family. That evening, he went to the park again. He needed to see the boy. Needed to see his son. The air was cool, the sun low, children running and laughing around him. When he saw the boy, his heart almost burst. The foster father noticed him and waved. "We got the call too," he said quietly as Richard approached. Richard nodded slowly, his voice trembling. "So it's true," the man smiled kindly. "It is." For a long moment, Richard couldn't speak. His emotions were too heavy. He knelt down again, looking at the boy. "Hi," he whispered. "I don't know if you understand what's happening, but I just found out that you're my son." The boy looked at him, confused. "You mean, you're my real dad?" Richard nodded, tears welling up again. "Yes," he said softly. "I am." The boy tilted his head, studying him. "But I already have a dad," he said, pointing at the foster father. Richard's heart squeezed painfully. "I know," he said, forcing a smile. "And he's a good one. I don't want to take that away from you. I want to be part of your life, if that's okay." The boy looked at both men, then shrugged. "Can I have two dads?" he asked innocently. The foster father laughed softly, his eyes glistening. "I don't see why not," he said. Richard laughed through his tears. "Then it's a deal," he said, holding out his pinky. The boy wrapped his tiny finger around his, sealing the promise. They spent the rest of the afternoon together. They walked around the park, talking about small things, school, favorite food, cartoons. Richard listened to every word as if it were music. He learned that the boy loved pancakes, loved to draw cars, and wanted to be a pilot someday. He couldn't stop smiling. Every laugh, every little word filled something inside him that had been empty for years. When it was time for the boy to leave, he hugged Richard before running off to join his foster father. It was a quick, simple hug, but it meant more to him than anything else in the world. After they left, Richard sat on the same bench for a long time, watching the sunset. He finally felt something he hadn't felt in decades: peace. Over the next few weeks, he started visiting regularly. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a book, a toy car, or snacks. But more often, he just came to talk. They would sit together, and the boy would tell him stories about school or funny things that happened during the day. The foster parents welcomed him kindly. They could see that he wasn't trying to take the boy away only to be part of his life. They started inviting him over for dinner sometimes. The house was modest but full of warmth, the kind of warmth he had been missing all along. One evening after dinner, the foster father handed him a cup of tea and said, "He really likes you, you know. You've got a second chance, Mr. Hamilton. Not many people get that." Richard smiled faintly. "I don't deserve it," he said. "Maybe not," the man said gently. "But you can still make it count." That night, Richard drove home feeling lighter. He thought of all the nights he had spent alone in his mansion, surrounded by silence. Now there was someone waiting for him to visit, someone who called him Dad. He started making small changes in his life. He cut down his work hours, started donating quietly to charities for children in foster care, and even funded scholarships for single mothers. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he finally understood what it meant to give. One Sunday, the little girl from the park spotted them together. She ran up to her parents, pointing excitedly. "Daddy, look! It's them!" "The man and my brother." Her father laughed, remembering that strange day. He waved at Richard, who smiled back warmly. Life had come full circle in the most unexpected way. Weeks turned into months. Richard and his son grew closer with each passing day. They built model airplanes together, visited the zoo, and spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes, when the boy laughed, Richard could almost hear Clara's voice echoing through him. It hurt, but in a beautiful way, like a wound finally beginning to heal. One night, as they sat by the window watching the rain, the boy asked softly, "Dad, do you miss Mom?" Richard swallowed hard. "Every day," he said quietly. "She was the best person I ever knew." The boy leaned against his arm. "She told me once that you'd come for me," he said. "When I was little, before she got sick. She said you were far away, but you'd find me one day." Tears filled his eyes. He put his arm around his son. "She was right," he whispered. "I'm here now." They sat in silence, the rain tapping gently against the glass. In that moment, the millionaire who had once thought he had everything realized that his true fortune wasn't in banks or buildings. It was right there beside him, in the small hand holding his arm, in the quiet trust that had grown between them. He couldn't change the past, but he could make sure the future was filled with love. And as he watched his son drift to sleep, Richard whispered a silent promise into the night, a promise that he would never leave again. The days that followed were different. Richard's life had taken a turn he never expected. For years, his days had been filled with phone calls, contracts, and meetings. Now his calendar had something new written on it: time with his son. He started arranging his schedule around the boys' school hours. Every week he made sure they had at least 2 afternoons together. They went to the park, had ice cream, or simply sat and talked. Sometimes they didn't even need words. Just being there was enough. The boy liked drawing cars. He would sit on the ground with a box of crayons and make colorful cars with wings, rockets, or even faces. Richard always praised him, keeping every drawing carefully folded in his briefcase. He had never imagined he would one day carry something so simple and precious in the same case that once held million-dollar contracts. One evening, they were walking home when the boy suddenly said, "Dad, why do people say you're rich?" Richard chuckled softly. "Because I have a lot of buildings and money, I suppose." The boy frowned. "But that doesn't make you rich. My teacher says people are rich when they have love." Richard stopped walking. For a moment he couldn't speak. The boy's words hit him like a quiet truth. He smiled faintly. "Your teacher is very wise," he said. The boy looked up at him. "Then you're rich now," he said confidently, slipping his small hand into his father's. Something inside Richard melted. He squeezed the boy's hand gently and whispered, "Yes, I think I finally am." At home, his life was changing too. His mansion, once filled with silence, started to feel alive again. The sound of small footsteps echoed in the hallways, followed by laughter and the scraping of crayons on paper. The housekeeper, who had worked there for years, couldn't help but smile. "It's been a long time since I heard laughter in this house," she said one afternoon. Richard smiled. "It's the best sound in the world," he said. He started decorating one of the guest rooms, not with luxury furniture or artwork, but with things that made the boy feel comfortable. A small bed with cartoon sheets, a shelf for toys, and a desk covered in drawing paper. He didn't want to rush things, but he wanted his son to know he had a place there whenever he wanted it. The boy's foster parents supported him wholeheartedly. They didn't see him as a threat. They saw him as another person who loved the child. They often invited him over for dinner, and sometimes he even helped the boy with his homework while they talked about family, values, and kindness. One weekend, they all went to the beach together. The sky was clear and the air smelled of salt. The boy ran toward the waves laughing, while Richard followed at a slower pace, watching him play. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened. The sound of waves, laughter, the seagulls overhead. It felt like life was giving him a second chance. He didn't want to waste it. He sat on the sand, his shoes off, the water washing gently over his feet. The boy ran up and placed a small shell in his hand. "For you," he said proudly. Richard smiled and held it tightly. "Thank you, son." They stayed there until the sun dipped into the sea, painting the sky in orange and gold. On the drive home, the boy fell asleep in the back seat. Richard glanced at him through the mirror, his chest tightening with love and guilt. He whispered softly, "I'll never leave you again." Not ever, but not everyone around him understood his change. At his office, some of his partners started to notice. He began declining late meetings, skipping networking events, and spending more time on personal matters. "Are you all right, Richard?" one of them asked. "You've been different lately." He smiled calmly. "I'm better than I've ever been," he said. They didn't understand, but he didn't care. For the first time, he felt like he was living, not just existing. Still, there was one thing he hadn't done yet. He hadn't told his son the full story. He had told him he was his father, but he hadn't shared the truth about why he wasn't there before. The boy never asked much. Children have a way of loving without needing explanations. But Richard knew the day would come when questions would rise. That day came sooner than he expected. One afternoon, they were sitting in the park, eating sandwiches, when the boy suddenly asked, "Dad, where were you before? Why didn't you come for me sooner?" The question was gentle, but it pierced deep. Richard's throat tightened. He looked at his son and took a deep breath. "I didn't know you existed," he said softly. "Your mother tried to tell me, but I was too blind to see what was important. I was young and thought success mattered more than anything else. I left to build a life and I didn't come back like I promised." The boy looked down at his sandwich. "Did you love Mom?" "More than anything," Richard said, his voice trembling. "But I didn't show it the way I should have. I thought I'd have time to fix things. I was wrong." The boy was quiet for a while, then looked up. "It's okay, Dad," he said simply. "You're here now." Those words hit Richard harder than any punishment life had ever given him. He blinked back tears and pulled his son into a hug. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're more forgiving than I deserve." The boy hugged him back tightly. "Mom said everyone makes mistakes," he said softly. "She said love can fix them." Richard smiled through his tears. She was right. She always was. After that day, their bond grew stronger. The boy started calling him Dad more often. He'd run into his arms when he saw him, and the sound of that small voice saying Dad became the most beautiful word Richard had ever heard. One evening, while they were building a toy airplane together, the boy said, "I want to fly real planes one day. Big ones. Can you come with me when I do?" Richard smiled. "I'll be in the front seat cheering you on," he said. The boy laughed. "No, I mean in the plane, next to me." "Then I'll be there," Richard said firmly. "Always." He meant every word, but even as things grew brighter, there was a shadow in Richard's heart. The guilt that he hadn't been there when Clara needed him most. One afternoon, he drove to the old part of the city where she used to live. The neighborhood had changed, but some things still looked familiar. He found the small church where her funeral had been held. The caretaker showed him a quiet corner in the cemetery where she rested. He stood there for a long time, holding a bouquet of lilies. The air was still and the sound of the city felt far away. He placed the flowers gently on the grave and whispered, "I found him, Clara. I found our son." His voice trembled. "He's everything you said he'd be, kind, smart, and full of life. I'm so sorry it took me this long. I can't change what happened, but I'll love him enough for both of us. I promise." He closed his eyes, letting the wind brush against his face. For the first time, he felt like she was listening, like she forgave him. When he returned home, the boy was waiting at the door, waving a piece of paper excitedly. "Dad, look. I got first place in the art contest." Richard took the drawing. It was a picture of a man and a boy holding hands under a bright sun. Written at the bottom in uneven handwriting were the words, "My dad and me." He looked at it for a long time, his eyes wet. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "Can I keep it?" "It's for you," the boy said proudly. He framed it that night and hung it on his office wall, right above his desk where his business awards used to hang. Whenever he looked at it, it reminded him what truly mattered. Life started to fall into a rhythm. They celebrated birthdays, went fishing, and even took short trips out of town. Richard taught his son how to ride a bike, cheering loudly every time he managed to go a few feet without falling. Each day, he felt like he was healing a part of himself that had been broken for too long. One evening, the boy's foster parents invited Richard for dinner again. After the meal, the foster father said gently, "You know, we've been talking. We think it's time you take full guardianship. He's your son. He deserves to be with you." Richard was speechless. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. The man smiled. "You've earned it. You love him, and he loves you." That's all that matters. Tears filled Richard's eyes. He reached across the table and shook the man's hand. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything you've done for him." That night he drove home with the boy asleep in the back seat again. The city lights glowed outside the window and the soft sound of the boy's breathing filled the car. Richard glanced at him through the mirror and whispered, "We're really a family now." The next morning, they moved his things into the house. Boxes of toys, drawings, and small clothes. The house felt alive like never before. They had breakfast together in the big kitchen, laughing as they spilled milk and syrup everywhere. The housekeeper joined in, smiling at the joyful mess. Later that day, Richard stood in the doorway of his son's new room. The sunlight poured in through the window, lighting up the shelves and the little desk. The boy was sitting on the bed surrounded by his toys, smiling from ear to ear. "Do you like it?" Richard asked. The boy nodded eagerly. "It's perfect," he said. "It feels like home." Richard's throat tightened. "That's because it is," he said softly. The boy ran to him and hugged him tightly. "I love you, Dad." He wrapped his arms around him and whispered, "I love you too, son." Outside, the world went on as usual. Cars passing, people walking, the sound of life everywhere. But inside that home, something had changed forever. For the first time in decades, Richard wasn't alone. His house was no longer just a symbol of wealth. It was a place of love, and as he watched his son play, laughing freely in the golden light of the afternoon, he realized that maybe, just maybe, life had given him the greatest gift, the chance to start over. The morning sun poured through the large windows, filling the house with soft light. The smell of toast and coffee drifted from the kitchen. The boy sat at the table, still in his pajamas, carefully spreading jam on his bread. Richard stood by the counter, watching him with quiet joy. It had been months since the boy had officially come to live with him, but every day still felt new. He had never known how peaceful a home could feel with laughter in it. Before mornings were silent, he used to eat breakfast alone, reading reports or replying to emails. Now his phone stayed on the counter, untouched. The sound of the boy humming while he ate was all the noise he wanted. "Dad?" the boy said, looking up. "Can we go to the park later?" Richard smiled. "Of course. We can go after lunch, and can I bring my kite?" "You can bring two if you want," he said with a chuckle. The boy laughed and nodded eagerly. "You're gonna lose again," he teased. "Not this time," Richard replied, pretending to be serious. "I've been practicing." They both laughed. It was the kind of morning that made life feel simple and perfect. After breakfast, the boy ran to get ready while Richard sat at the table for a moment longer, sipping his coffee and looking around the house. The framed drawings on the walls, the shoes by the door, the small backpack on the chair, all of it reminded him that this house was no longer just his. It was theirs. He picked up his phone, opened his camera roll, and looked at the photos from the past few months. The beach day, the art contest, the bike ride. The first time his son had called him Dad without hesitation. Every picture was a piece of a life he never thought he'd have. That afternoon they went to the park, the same park where everything had started. The air was warm, the trees danced gently with the wind, and children's laughter filled the air. The boy ran ahead, kite in hand, while Richard followed, holding another kite under his arm. They found an open spot near the field. The boy turned and grinned. "Ready?" "Always," Richard said. They counted to 3 and both ran. The kite soared into the air, climbing higher with every gust of wind. The boy's laughter echoed across the park. Richard couldn't stop smiling. For a moment he thought about how strange life was, how one random afternoon at this same park had changed everything, how a little girl's innocent words had brought his lost son back to him. As they sat on the grass later, catching their breath, the boy said, "Dad, do you ever get sad?" Richard looked at him thoughtfully. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "But then I remember how lucky I am now. That makes the sadness smaller." The boy nodded. "I get sad too sometimes," he said softly. "When I think about Mom." Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to miss her," he said gently. "I miss her too. But you know what? I think she's happy when she sees us together." The boy smiled faintly. "You really think so?" "I do," Richard said. "She wanted you to be loved. That's what I'm trying to do every day." The boy leaned against him quietly, and for a while they just watched the kites drift across the sky. In the months that followed, their bond grew deeper. They found a rhythm: school, dinners, little adventures on weekends. Richard even began taking fewer business trips. His assistant noticed the change and once asked, "Aren't you worried about stepping away so often?" Richard smiled and said, "No deal is more important than being a father." He started donating to children's homes and programs for single mothers. He never told anyone why. It wasn't about publicity or image. It was his way of saying thank you. To life, to second chances, to the unseen kindness that had brought his son back. Every few weeks, they still visited the orphanage where the boy had once stayed. The boy loved spending time with the other children, playing soccer or sharing his crayons. One day, one of the caretakers said softly to Richard, "He's happier than ever. You gave him what money never could." Richard smiled and said, "He gave me the same thing." That night, they sat in the backyard under the stars. The boy had a small telescope, a gift from his teacher. He pointed at the sky. "Look, Dad, that's Orion," he said proudly. "Very good," Richard said. "You've been studying." The boy nodded. "I like the stars. They make me feel like Mom's up there watching." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat. "Maybe she is," he said softly. They stayed there a long time talking about space and dreams. The boy said he wanted to become a pilot someday. Richard promised to help him do it. Life moved on gently. Seasons changed. The boy grew taller, his laughter louder, his heart even bigger. One spring morning, Richard got a call from the school. The boy had been chosen to give a short speech at the end-of-year ceremony. He was nervous but excited. "Can you come, Dad?" he asked that evening. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Richard said. On the day of the ceremony, the hall was full of parents, teachers, and students. Richard sat in the front row, heart pounding with pride. When it was his son's turn, the boy walked to the microphone, holding a small card in his hand. He looked around the room, spotted his father, and smiled. "My name is Leo," he began softly, his voice clear and steady. "When I came to this school, I didn't know what family really meant. But now I do. Family means someone who stays, someone who cares, and someone who helps you be brave." He paused, then looked straight at Richard. "My dad taught me that. He showed me what love really is." The room fell silent for a moment, then filled with applause. Richard couldn't stop the tears that rolled down his face. He stood up, clapping, his heart so full it hurt. After the ceremony, the boy ran into his arms. "Did I do okay?" he asked shyly. Richard hugged him tightly. "You did more than okay," he said. "You made me the proudest man in the world." As they walked out of the hall hand in hand, the sunlight hit their faces. It felt like the world itself was smiling at them. Later that summer, they took a trip together, just the two of them. They visited a small town by the lake, far from the city noise. They rented a little cabin, cooked simple meals, and spent the evenings by the water. One night, sitting on the dock, the boy asked, "Dad, do you ever wish you could go back in time?" Richard looked at the rippling water. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I think, if I went back, maybe I'd change something and never find you. So no, I don't want to change the past anymore. I just want to make the most of what we have now." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad you found me," he said. Richard smiled softly. "I think you found me," he said. The boy laughed. "Maybe we found each other." "That sounds about right," Richard said with a grin. When they returned home, the house felt warmer than ever. They filled it with pictures from their trip. The lake, the dock, the kite-flying moments. The walls told their story now. Years went by quietly. The boy grew into a young man. He still called his father every day, even after going away to study aviation. Every call began with the same cheerful, "Hey, Dad," and ended with, "Love you." Richard never missed a graduation, a flight test, or a birthday. He was there for every milestone, big or small, and sometimes, when he sat by the window in the evenings watching the sky turn gold, he thought of how close he had come to living a life without love, a life filled with success but empty inside. Now, he had everything that truly mattered. One day, years later, his son took him on a flight, a small plane, just the two of them. As the plane lifted off the ground, Richard looked out the window, tears in his eyes. His son smiled from the pilot's seat. "You ready, Dad?" Richard laughed. More than ever. As they soared higher into the blue sky, the sun shining through the clouds, he felt a peace he had never known before. He looked at his son and thought of Clara, of fate, of that day in the park when everything had changed. The past no longer hurt the same way. It had become part of the story that brought him here. When they landed, his son turned and said, "We did it." Richard smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No," he said gently. "You did it. You made every dream come true." That evening they went back to the same park, now filled with families and laughter. Children ran around just like the day it all began. They sat on a bench together watching the sunset. The boy looked at his father and said softly, "Dad, do you ever think about how it all started?" Richard smiled. "Every single day," he said, "and I still can't believe how lucky I am." As the sky turned orange and pink, they sat there in silence, hearts full. The boy leaned his head on his father's shoulder, and Richard closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the moment. Life had come full circle, from loss to love, from regret to redemption,